Okay. All right. We can actually start. And I think we are all ready to begin. And you allow me to share the slides. But before I share the slides, let me just make some more introductory remarks on what we covered last time and what we promised to do, right? Of course, our journey has been slightly longer, and we're trying to look at issues that relate to problem statement, right? How we can actually generate a problem statement, but applying most of the knowledge that we think is very important. And of course, the implication here is that as we started off last time, we did indicate that we must not forget the issue of paradigms. I hope you still remember where we started from. We started with paradigms, and we did indicate that these, in one way or the other, guide the problem statement and eventually the construction of the statement of the problem. I'm not really giving you detailed perspectives about that, but maybe at an opportune moment I'll do so. The other aspect I did bring out is the fact that the philosophical orientations are important, and I did talk about philosophical orientations under each of the paradigms that I presented. Then from there, we went into details about how we can pick this information from wherever it is available, right? Whether it is in published sources, what we call scholarly literature, and probably sometimes in gray literature, right? And gray literature are actually the reports that are available in various organizations, or probably available about the sector, right? And I know that maybe before the end of this lecture, I'll be talking about those aspects. Now, from those aspects, we went, I think, up to what we covered yesterday, if you remember. And yesterday, we are talking about gap spotting and problematization, because once you go through literature, you are able to spot the gaps. And we looked at the various types of gaps, right? I believe now you know the types of gaps that we pick from literature, right? We had the detailed discussion, and I think we had about 3 lectures about that. If I go through those aspects, then we'll be wasting a lot of time and we'll not be able to cover new material. But we shall have an opportunity, maybe the concluding lecture, which might be this week, about problem statement, gap spotting, and the mistakes that are made, common mistakes up to problematization and constructing a statement of the problem. Probably that will be covered within the course of the week, right? So, and later on, I think maybe that will not be the concluding lecture, but the concluding lecture might now be how you are able to write your chapter 1, which is the introduction chapter, in your thesis and probably proposal. What kind of information should you place there, right? I know we've covered a lot about gap spotting and problematization, but people might be wondering exactly where do we place this information? And I saw a confusion that arose when someone asked a question last week that, we've been taught, right? And actually she said, now I'm getting confused, because for us, we've been taught wherever we are pursuing our PhDs, that this is how we do it, right? We identify, right, some kind of issue, right, that is bothering us, right? And then we look at the actual problem, right? Now you are talking about gaps, right, and bring in philosophy. I'm getting more confused, right? How do we do this? And I was very diplomatic enough to say, well, follow the procedures that have been given to you by your university, because that is the awarding university, right? But ideally, every thesis, irrespective of where you are doing it from, whether you are doing it from Nairobi, Makerere University, German, UK, or USA, there are those things that are expected to be within a particular thesis or doctoral thesis, whether in the chapter 1 or chapter 2 or chapter 3. And we can call that really, we can call them international conventions of writing a thesis. And that's why your work will be sent to someone who is in Germany or somebody who is in UK. So the standards that are expected, right, should be the same, right? At least, I mean, the structure might change, right? Where you place what might change a little bit, but the standards remain the same, right? And do not forget that. So yesterday we looked at constructing and problematizing literature. And if you recall, let me just see if I can share my slides here. The ones that I used yesterday, just for purposes of reminding you the things that we did cover. And these are actually very important. So you can see our slide here, right? Presents, let me just put in a slide show, I hope. Are you able to see my slides? Right.
Yes, Professor, we're able to see.
So that is what we covered yesterday. If you want to generate a high impact doctoral research problem. So we went through gap spotting, if you remember, and we ended up with problematization, right? And I did tell you that all this information comes from literature, and literature review certainly occupies a central place in scholarly research. And that's why I actually emphasize the fact that we do not only look at it as a preliminary stage within your work or even a summary of what has been reviewed, but just taking it as a sophisticated intellectual exercise that you will engage in as a researcher, and you engage with existing knowledge, you engage with the evaluating the strengths and limitations, and of course, establish what we call scholarly foundations for your own investigation, and that is very important. So whereas those gaps were discussed in detail, if you remember, and I gave you examples of a few of the gaps, but then after that, you must move towards literature review, right? Because all this information comes from literature. And that's why we call it active and critical and constructive process. And of course, we looked at the ways of constructing literature. Again, these ideas were taken from Golden, Biddle, and Block. Right. And I think they recommend about 3 ways of constructing literature. And that is synthesized coherence, progressive coherence, and non-coherence. We covered that in detail yesterday. And then from there, you need to problematize, right? Whereas you constructed that, but problematizing literature is very, very important. And we also saw a number of ways that we can actually use to problematize literature, right? And I did give you some of the methods, right, that we use to problematize literature, right? And of course, you are very familiar now with those 3, right? You you problematize it in terms of literature being incomplete, right, or probably being inadequate, right, and you know exactly what we cover under that. And just as I did indicate, whereas you can identify the gaps from literature, right, and you can construct, right, literature from either using synthesized coherence, progressive coherence, or non-coherence, right? But within those three, right, ways of constructing literature, you must problematize your literature. And I told you that problematization refers to the process of identifying limitations, the process of identifying deficiencies, the process of identifying contradictions or weaknesses within existing knowledge. And of course, after identifying that, you must move towards problematization. And under problematization, you are answering the question of why, right, is this study important? Because unless you provide that element of importance, then scholars will say, yes, you have identified a gap and you have constructed your literature to bring out that particular gap, right? But why is it important? I mean, the mere fact that we've not had sufficient research in that particular area, it does not make the area very important, right, and useful for you to spend 3 years or 4 years or 5 years undertaking research. So in other words, the construction of literature, right, will answer questions like what does the field currently look like? In other words, you are able to map the area, but after mapping the area, then you bring out that element why the study is important. And that's why Gordon Biddle and Locke actually brings out those three ways of problematizing literature. And I told you, again, if you recall, under incompleteness, you are portraying literature, right, as unfinished. In other words, existing knowledge in this case is viewed as valuable and fundamentally correct, but, right, important aspects remain unexplored. And that's why you are actually undertaking a study in that particular area. Right, again, inadequacy, as we saw, in other words, you are portraying literature as limited, right, because it includes certain things, but at the same time, it excludes important perspectives and contexts and possibly assumptions or some explanatory frameworks that need to be looked at. So, of course, here, the problem is not that knowledge is unfinished, rather, the current explanations that exist within the knowledge domain or within literature provide on a partial understanding of the phenomenon. So that's why you want to get into that area and have another view, right, so that we understand the area very well. Now, of course, the other aspect is in terms of knowledge being incommensurate. And if you recall, under that element of incommensurate, right? So you do not really focus on knowledge, right? Not being really incomplete or maybe aspects have not been explored or explanations have not been taken into consideration. But you are able to give a position, right, where you indicate that knowledge that exists in that area, right, is actually wrong or misguided in some way. And I told you that this incommensurality represents the strongest and the most radical form of problematization. And of course, here you bring up an argument, right, where you are able to indicate that some of the things that have been believed over time are actually wrong. And I gave you an example of, I think I gave you examples from economics, if you remember, right? Where I gave an example traditional economics, right, and behavioral economics, right. So if you look at the way traditional economists were looking at certain issues, those issues were actually overturned by people who brought up this new field of behavioral economics. In other words, these people were able to indicate that traditional economics, for example, assumed a rational decision making, right? But under behavioral economics, the economists actually demonstrated that decision making is frequently shaped by things like cognitive biases, by emotions and heuristics. And of course, when they did this, the challenge was directed not at the missing variables or maybe some of the possible explanations that have been forgotten by researchers, but they actually they were able to challenge the foundational assumptions of rationality as a concept itself, meaning that a rational human being may not actually exist, but of course, meaning that there are those behavioral aspects that must be factored in. And that's how the new field of behavioral economics actually came into being. So as you can see, existing research is not portrayed as incomplete or probably as missing some other explanations, but as wrong or even misguided in a certain way. So, and of course here, the existing research seeks to overthrow existing views or paradigms, and that's how the traditional economic perspective or rationality was overthrown by behavioral economics. So all those are aspects that we actually covered last time or yesterday, ladies and gentlemen. And of course, we ended at a time when there was a student who asked a question here, right? And I just wanted to show you this question because, again, time allowing, we may use the example, right, of the question that was asked by a student. This was in the chat room, and I picked it up from the chat room, right? And the student asked a question, how can I problematize this, right? And his issue was unaccompanied refugee minors who are excluded from participation in matters that concerns them, and whose agency has been ignored and seen as only passive recipients of aid, yet they can contribute to decision making and even propose interventions that best suit their conditions. I saw this as a very nice question, actually, that can make us understand the perspectives that I thought that we should be able to look at. And I think, again, time allowing, that is a question from our colleague, Wilson. And I think if time allows, then we shall be able to interrogate that particular aspect, ladies and gentlemen. So having said that, that's just a recap of what we covered. And I don't think we need these slides again. But allow me to take you to another aspect that we shall use to try and understand this element of the problem statement, right? And how we can actually construct, right, our statement of the problem, right? Now, of course, I know the confusion that is likely to come up here, and just as like the other student did indicate, is the issue of, I mean, what we are traditionally taught, right, in the various places, right? Someone will tell you, no, if you're going to write a statement of the problem, right, these are the things that you should actually have in the statement of the problem, right? If you're going to write the introduction, these are the things, but they never tell you how to do it, right? And so if someone comes up and begins talking about the elements that constitute a problem statement, you begin assuming straight away that we are writing a statement of the problem because you have those two words, the way they are ordered. Here we have problem statement, And then the other section that usually comes at the end of the introduction chapter is the statement of the problem. And usually there's a confusion because when you talk about the problem statement, then the other fellow starts automatically thinking about the statement of the problem. It says, now, how do I go around this? Don't you worry, just keep on waiting. We shall be able to construct some of those. Because now you know how to construct problem statements. You've been doing it, and I've given you many examples, right? And I don't think you will be asking a question of how a problem statement looks like. Now, your anticipation should be on how do I write a statement of a problem, not a problem statement, because you now know what it is and the components that actually constitute it. So, ladies and gentlemen, today these will be our learning objectives, right, where we'll be able to come up with the role of problem statement and then identify common weaknesses and distinguish practical versus scholarly problems and evaluate research problems and, of course, construct stronger problem statements. But I may not really take you through the construction of the stronger problem statements because we've been doing this all along, right? But of course, we need to understand the problem statement and why it matters in this case. So, of course, as I did indicate, ladies and gentlemen, yesterday, the statement, right, the problem statement in this case is usually the most scrutinized section of the proposal, right? Your proposal and thesis and dissertation, right? Even journals and the grants, right? And the reason is very simple because it demonstrates scholarly maturity, it demonstrates theoretical sensitivity, and it demonstrates literature mastery. And I do not really think that you really want me to go into details of this because I've been demonstrating these things, right, right from the time when we started up to where we are now, right? But I just wanted to go straight to, let me not go into that, but take you straight to the confusion, right, that students usually have when they are developing problem statements, right? Remember, this is an important area, right? And these aspects will always permeate through your introduction chapter. And of course, the introduction chapter has so many components there, right? Right from the background to the study, right? Then you go into the, of course, within the background, you have all those small subsections, right, where you bring out the historical development of the construct, right, the theoretical arguments also being presented. Then you go into the conceptual, the contextual, and so forth, right, and then, of course, highlighting a gap, right, within the literature. All that, right, has to come in within the introduction section before you finally land down there with the statement of the problem, right? But before we land with the statement of the problem, right, I just want to show you the mistakes that we actually make. And I think understanding the mistake or mistakes that we make is important because unless you know where we go wrong, then it becomes very hard for you to craft one that will make an impact. And I'll tell you that one of the common mistakes, right, is where people actually confuse, right, a topic of the study, right, or study topic, whatever it is, right, and the problem, right. And of course, confusing a research topic with a research problem can be fatal, right? Because we know very well that a topic identifies a broad area of a study or broad area of interest, right? Whereas really a research problem identifies a specific knowledge deficiency within that particular area, right? And that's why I told you that it's one of the most scrutinized area because they expect you to have mastery of literature, to have mastery of the area, right, where you are undertaking research. So a topic will give you that particular area, but a research problem will identify specific knowledge deficiency within that particular area, right? And that's what you end up actually studying. So unfortunately, many doctoral students confuse the topics as if they were actually problems, and that can be a very serious issue, ladies and gentlemen, right? Now, of course, the second issue that you see there is describing symptoms instead of causes, right? And again, that is another issue, right? And of course, many students describe symptoms of a phenomenon, right, without investigating the underlying causes or probably explanations. Right. Now, symptoms are usually observable manifestations of deeper processes. So unless you sit down to reflect and think through your research, you can easily mistake those particular symptoms for a problem, right? So research, ladies and gentlemen, in this case, should always seek explanations rather than really describing outcomes, because many people are very good at describing outcomes. And once they describe those outcomes, they think that they have got it, right, when in actual sense they haven't. Let me just give you an example, right, of a symptom, right, and of course the underlying question, right. For example, you might have, and I see students stating this, they'll say, well, I'm studying employee turnover, right? And the student will say, well, there is a high employee turnover, right? Now, of course, the underlying question that you should always ask, if you have seen, and you have statistics and evidence to prove, right, that there is a high employee turnover. Now, you should ask yourself, why, right, employee turnover, right, or that high employee turnover or employee turnover, why does it persist, right, within an organization, right, other than just describing, right, that I see people leaving, and we have the figures, and you're able to articulate and say, well, for the last 5 years, right, for example, in 2020, the turnover was about 5%, right, around 2021, it went 7%, 2023, it hit 10%, 2025, right, we have about 15%. Yes, that is a high turnover, right? Within the last 5 years, you have experienced that, right? But if you're simply going to describe that high turnover and stop there, then that is not a high impact doctoral thesis that you are writing and articulating the problem, right? The issue should be, why is it persisting, right? The persistence of that turnover is what makes this kind of issue researchable, right? Can we try to look for explanations rather than describing the causes? So I think you can see that a weak problem statement will simply say employee turnover is increasing, right? But that is merely describing a symptom, right? So a very strong problem statement then will articulate issues and say, well, despite the implementation of, let's say, retention programs within this particular organization, right, employee turnover remains persistently high, right? So in other words, the problem is persisting despite the fact that we have put in place these retention programs. So, and of course, you continue to indicate that, existing retention theories, right, that we are aware of, provide limited explanation, right, of employee maybe attachment, right, under hybrid work programs, meaning that now you're going to undertake this kind of study to explore, right, what is happening within that particular. I mean, what I'm giving is hypothetical explanation for something that seems to make much more sense. And that's why I took you through gap spotting, because if you're going to bring in now the issue of theories, that means you must have understood your literature very well. You must have understood your area very well and what exists in that particular area, ladies and gentlemen. Now, the other mistake that we make is presenting solutions before establishing problems. And many students actually do that, right? They prematurely introduce solutions before establishing the nature of the problem, before understanding that problem very well, right? And of course, this creates what we call confirmation bias. And that's why your doctoral committee will be telling you, but you already know what is happening, right? And you have even given us a solution, right, to the issue. So why should you, I mean, was it necessary for you to really undertake a doctoral research in this particular area, right? And that is very, very common, because the researcher then at this material time appears to have what we call predetermined answers to the issue that he's talking about. So that's why sometimes you find for the students who are in the area of procurement, right, they will say, well, in order to improve procurement, let's say compliance, organizations should do strengthen, for example, ethical training, right? So in other words, in this case, the solution seems to appear before the problem, ladies and gentlemen. So I think you can see this is a very serious issue that we need to think about, right? And of course, you think about this issue by knowing exactly what you are going to do, right? So unless you articulate this area very well, then we shall not be able to understand what you are doing, right? So I think you can see the other fourth element, right, where we go wrong, right, is in terms of writing over a broad problems, right? And I think you have seen students doing that, right? In other words, the broad problems that you are coming up with are very difficult to conceptualize to begin with. They are very difficult to investigate. They are very difficult to measure. They are very difficult to analyze, and very difficult to complete, right? So you need to narrow, right, your issue, right? Let me just give you an example. Someone making a statement like, right, climate change affects Africa, right? I mean, climate change affects Africa, and you are studying climate change, right? That becomes very, very broad. Or someone says corruption exists in the government, right? That is also very weak, right, and broad. Or someone says education quality is declining, right? I think you can see how broad these things are, right? So those are very, very broad, right? But we expect you to say, for example, existing climate change adaptation models, right, provide limited understanding of how, for example, social capital influences adaptive capacity among smallholder farmers in eastern Uganda, or probably in Uganda or central Uganda, right? I mean, what you are stating now is something that is scholarly, something that can be, right, researched, other than simply stating that, you know, climate change affects Uganda, right? Or climate change affects Africa, right? Or just saying corruption exists in government, right? That is very, very broad. But the moment you bring it down, right, despite the existence of regulatory mechanisms, right? And you can even state those particular regulatory mechanisms that exist, right, within Uganda, right? You have corruption. Now, if corruption is persisting in government entities, despite all those things that you have mentioned, then it gives us a reason to begin thinking of what is happening in that particular area, ladies and gentlemen. So that is very, very important for us to think about. Now, the fifth mistake again is failing to identify a knowledge gap, right? That's why I have been having lectures, right, articulating gaps, right, and telling you the types of gaps, right, and how they actually arise, and the ones that you should actually think about, especially at your PhD level, right? Now, of course, this is what I should call the most serious weaknesses in the doctoral proposals, right? And of course, thesis, right? That is really the failure to identify a knowledge gap. So many students in this case actually describe practical concerns, right? But never explain what remains unknown. So they would tell you about for example, employee turnover. They describe, give you the statistics. They can even give you the charts and the graphs and so forth. In other words, demonstrating to you how serious the issue is, right? But they may stop at that and not even give you the impression that this is a persistent issue, right, within these particular organizations. But they may not be able to tie it up, right, with a knowledge gap that exists. In other words, they cannot bring in the theoretical explanations or the conceptual gaps, right, or the temporal gaps that I talked about last time, and so forth. So at the end of the day, you have a problem. So in other words, this is one of the serious, right? Because if you don't have any gap, then there's no scholarly justification. You only become a consultant, actually, meaning that you could as well have employed a consultant to undertake that study, and you don't need a PhD, right, to do that kind of work. And this is the most serious weakness in doctoral proposals, ladies and gentlemen. So in other words, I think let me just give you examples of of how students state things, right? Again, from the experience I've had over the years supervising doctoral students, right? Someone will say, corruption remains widespread in public procurement, right? And he's only operating at that particular level, right? Of course, this is a practical issue, right? Student has identified a practical issue, which is okay, right? But you need to go beyond that. And there is no knowledge gap that is specified. So for me, I expect you to move beyond that and state that, for example, despite extensive procurement reforms, right, corruption remains prevalent in public institutions. And then you go ahead and indicate that existing studies emphasize legal, right, and procedural determinants while providing limited understanding of how informal institutional norms shape those corrupt practices. So if you are able to move, right, from a practical issue and then integrate a knowledge gap that exists, right, then you'll be able to move. So, of course, the importance of a knowledge gap is that it gives you, right, that important element of filling a gap within a particular scholarly domain, so that we know that you have also contributed knowledge in that particular perspective. Right, now the sixth gap, as you can see here, or mistake is ignoring theory, right? Now we forget that theory is very important because it frames problems and what's contribution. Right, many students never bring in theory, right? And as a result, they think that they've done a great job. No wonder last time when I was actually making a presentation at Makerere, a student from natural sciences said that for us in our area, we don't have, in the natural sciences, we don't have theories, we don't use theories, right? And when that student actually made that comment, because I wasn't very familiar with the natural sciences, although I had done a few studies, collaborative studies in public health. So it really worked on me because I had seen some theoretical explanations somewhere in public health, but I wondered why a student had made that statement. So I did not take it for granted. So I actually went and downloaded a number of journal articles from medicine and some other areas in the natural sciences to see whether what the student was saying was correct. Right. Now, I discovered that actually the student was mistaken. Right. Of course, if your doctoral committee says that you don't use a theory, please don't use it. Go ahead and do what they ask you to do. But that does not mean that a theory is useless, right? And it cannot be invoked in your study, right? So this is a mistake that usually happens, right? People forget that theory frames problems and theory actually supports contribution. If in your case you have decided to use frameworks, right, which frameworks again were developed from theoretical perspectives or integration of theories, that is okay, right? If your supervisor is used to frameworks, right, and that's what you are using, it does not mean that theories are not important, because these frameworks actually come from theories, right? So if they integrate and they say, well, now we want to interrogate this, and there is a gap that I think is important, please go ahead. But your work will be much stronger, again, if you looked at those particular theories where the frameworks come from and see whether there are certain aspects that you can integrate within your work. So again, you can see this is a mistake that we make. Therefore, as doctoral students, always engage theory, engage theories, right? Don't write problem statements without any theoretical underground or theoretical grounding, right, in this case. Right, we need the theory because the theory explains, right, your phenomenon, right? And sometimes we have limited understanding, right, of the phenomenon as a result of using certain theoretical frameworks or even using certain models, right, and perspectives. So I think when the students fail to do this, in this case, they end up with the descriptive research rather than what we call scholarly research, right? I'll give you an example again from some of the studies that some students are undertaking, maybe from family businesses and in entrepreneurship. But the student might actually say that many family businesses fail after succession, right? Like a student last time who was actually studying business mortality, right? And the student said, well, I have looked at literature, right, and I've looked at empirical evidence that is available, and even grey literature. I have discovered that many small businesses actually do not live to celebrate their third birthday or fifth birthday. And the fellow demonstrated the mortality rate, right, from all that. And of course, he had a statement which is very close to the one I've just made, that many family businesses fail, right? Maybe after succession, right? Or probably many family businesses do not actually live to celebrate their first, second, third, or fourth birth, right? And of course, within that, you see that no theory is invoked, right? No theory is involved, right, within that particular work. So if you want to come up with a very strong problem statement, then you should indicate that although, and you can bring in any theory, of course, depending on what you want to investigate, that although resource-based theory identifies valuable resources as sources of competitive advantage, it provides limited explanation regarding how such resources are transferred and renewed across generations in family-owned businesses, right? And by the way, sometimes you may find that even businesses that have they are endowed with resources, right, really failing to succeed. And those small businesses that have limited resources are succeeding, right, within a highly competitive environment. Again, those explanations may not have been provided. So why does theory then matter in this case? Theory matters because it frames the problems, ladies and gentlemen. Never forget that. The theory guides inquiry, and therefore you must have theory in your work. Theory is very important because it facilitates contribution, ladies and gentlemen, and theory supports cumulative knowledge development in that particular discipline, right? And of course, if you use that element of theory, you are likely to bring in, right, many people to appreciate the kind of work that you are doing, ladies and gentlemen. Now, the seventh mistake, ladies and gentlemen, that many of you make at this level is relying on personal opinions, right? There's a statement I was going to make, probably I better not make it here, but let me just say something very close to this, right? You know, in some universities, they have established, right, certain milestones that must be followed, right, in making probably is representing your work, right, and maybe your doctoral committees, right, or even the promoters of your research want to know whether you are progressing or not really progressing. Another, they will tell you that stage number one, right, you must bring this and show it to us. Stage number two, you must also show us this. Stage number three, you must. Now, when students actually master this kind of thing, especially those very interesting students that are not interested in learning, right? They are just interested in the three words, PhD. So the fellow will say, well, after all, what the doctoral committee wants are presentations. So they will get, they might get slides from another student somewhere, right, and simply remove, right, the constructs and the topic, and they simply insert their work there. So they will be coming to you and making those presentations, and you think that the students actually are doing very well and is actually progressing. But when they actually sense the students not doing anything, so at the end of the day, well, you will tell the student, I think now you are ready, you can submit your dissertation for examination, right? And then the fellow disappears because the fellow has not been having any work, but you have released the fellow, right? So now he must sit down and concoct a number of things so that he puts together a thesis that he will submit, right? And I think you can see that this can be very, very dangerous. So that's why I'm saying that students rely on personal opinions, right? So in other words, this mistake is important for us to know, and for me, I know it, because students rely on beliefs, students believe on assumptions, students rely on personal experience rather than evidence, actually. So they end up crafting research problems from opinion, right, and not necessarily from evidence, right? So I'll tell you, a student will come to you and say, you know what, right? I believe that in this situation that we are, that I'm investigating, leadership, right, is the main cause of project failure, right? Projects are failing, right, in this organization, or probably projects are failing at the national level. And I think the leadership, right, is the major cause of this, right? So I think you can see that the students relying on personal opinions, right? In other words, they replace opinions, right? They actually replace evidence with opinions, right? But now we are just telling you that you should actually have evidence. So what we want in this case, if you are going to do a good job, ladies and gentlemen, is for you to say, well, several studies, right? And you must be having really scholarly evidence to prove the point that several studies identify leadership as determinant of project outcomes, right? However, our findings remain inconsistent, right, regarding mechanisms through which leadership influences project sustainability, right? And if you can provide evidence to support that, I think you would have done a good job, ladies and gentlemen. So in this case, that means the student understands theory, the student understands empirical evidence that exists in that area, right? And he has interrogated that element. Ladies and gentlemen, the other mistake is probably providing no evidence, right? Maybe I shouldn't even spend too much time on this. At least now you can see where we are coming from and where we are going, right? Maybe I should even stop on this slide and close this so that we now go into another interesting area that we should be thinking about, right? So I think you can see here, right, providing no evidence, right? And of course, many students make bold claims, right, without evidence, right? And yet evidence establishes credibility and significance, right? So just saying corruption is increasing everywhere, right? That's just a very, very funny statement, right? Say there is lack of transparency, right? Please provide evidence, ladies and gentlemen, right? Evidence establishes credibility, evidence demonstrates significance, evidence justifies investigation, right? Without evidence, claims that you make remain speculative, right? And that could be an issue. Maybe lastly, I should say that students end up writing objectives instead of problems. So when you go through the introduction, the entire introduction, you fail to see the problem, right? So students confuse in many cases, or sometimes. I'm not saying that all, but some of them confuse objectives with the problem, right? So they forget that objectives describe what the study intends to do, while problems describe why the study is necessary. And the moment you forget that the problem, right, is describing why the study is necessary, and then objectives, right, just give you what the study intends to do, then you have problems, right? But if you know those two very well, then you will be able to move on. So, so just saying that, therefore, the purpose of this study is to examine employee engagement, right? Really, I mean, that is not good enough, right? This is more or less an objective and not a problem in this case, right? So we expect you to say, well, despite substantial investments in engagement initiatives, right, within maybe the public sector, employee engagement remains low, and existing theories inadequately explain engagement dynamics under hybrid work conditions, right? And then, of course, in that case, you will have done a great job, right? Maybe the 10th one I should give is failing to demonstrate significance, right? So students actually fail to show that, right? A student may identify a gap, but fail to explain why that gap matters. I think I've been talking about these issues from time to time, right? Because not every gap deserves research, as we saw, right? So a problem to attract some bit of attention to scholarly work in this case, right? That problem must be significant, right? And this element of significance is very, very important, ladies and gentlemen. And when we talk about significance, remember we have many types of significance, right? We have theoretical significance, right? In other words, it advances the theory. We have practical significance. Your work improves practice in that case. Then we have policy significance. That means that your work will be able to support policy, right? Because now we want evidence-based policies. In other words, it must feed into the policies. So meaning that you should actually review some of the policies, right? Then, of course, there's also social significance. In other words, your work addresses societal concerns, right? And then there are also methodological significance. In other words, your work improves research approaches. And that's why in many cases, when you're after your discussion section of the thesis, you've got theoretical implications, you've got practical implications, you've got policy implications, you have social implications, you have methodological implications. So that is where the whole issue comes from. Ladies and gentlemen, as I said, I think we should not be wasting too much time in this area, right? Because there are many more things that we need to think about than actually concentrating on the problems that students make. Right, maybe I will pause a little bit here as I look for the slides, right, that will constitute our next and probably last part of the presentation, right? And that is really developing a doctoral statement of the problem, right? So that we understand the problem very, very well. Because I know many students have difficulties, right, articulating a statement of the problem. Right. Let me see. Right. Oh, what's someone saying? Okay. No, I don't seem to have any question there. Okay, let me first go through this, right? Developing the statement of the problem, right? So that from there, we can go ahead, right, and interrogate this issue, right? And this area is very important because unless we understand how to write the statement of the problem, then we are finished. Okay, let me just share, right? And then if you have any question, you can ask before we move to the statement of the problem, right? And I'll be giving you examples, right, on how we actually do that, right? And the components that actually constitute a statement of the problem, right? Right, any question? We are now going to the statement of the problem. Statement of the problem. Again, we are going to use, I don't know whether our friend William is around. William Kwikiriza, are you around?
Yes, Prof, I am around, please.
Fantastic. I'm going to use your example, right? I hope you have no issues with that, right? So that we move actually from we move from gap spotting to crafting a statement of the problem, right? And again, we shall be coming from the various perspectives, coming from Karl Popper, right? Those are things that we did study last time, right? Karl Popper and of course, we went to Kuhn, right? Then we went to lactose. Then we went to Loudon, if you recall, plus a number of other scholars that we talked about. Right. So I'll be giving these components. Then after giving the components, we shall proceed. Right. Any comment? Any comments? Any question? I've looked through the chat room. I'm not seeing any.
Prof, I have a, I don't know, I'm a bit confused.
Yes.
I need your guidance here. I heard that objectives and research questions are different in the way they are relayed, in terms of the information you're going to write. Now, I'm just wondering, like, when you have, for instance, those hypotheses and objectives reflecting each other, what is the golden thread then there?
Right. I think now you are asking me to evaluate the knowledge that you have picked from various areas. I remember sometime, let me just give you a story before I probably respond, right, to your question. One day we had a presentation, right? And I had made a presentation about something in the morning, right? And then afterwards, someone made a presentation thereafter, and the student got a bit confused, right? And when a student got confused, right, and I could see the source of confusion, right? Because the student asked a question, and the student who asked the question seemed actually to know, right? But because there was a contradiction in what we had presented, what I had presented and what the other fellow had presented, a student asked a question. And when that student asked a question, the gentleman answered, right? I'm not giving you the actual question because you now begin speculating, because I can see on the platform we're about to, let me see the numbers. We're about 165, meaning that you are likely to speculate and probably get it right, right? So when a student asked that question, a student seemed to know. And for me, I must actually thank the student, because that means the student had actually studied, right? And he was very familiar with knowledge. Right, now someone struggled to answer, right? And he struggled, but the student kept on asking and asking, but, right, and I could understand. Now, when I was given an opportunity to speak, right, the student asked me a question. Now, that question, I dodged it intentionally, because one, I did not want to create some bit of confusion, right, within the same lecture room, right? And then would begin a fight that would probably not end very well. So me, I answered and I said, you people have been sending you books, right? And you are PhD students. Why don't you go and read, right? Why don't you go and read? And that was the answer. But actually what the student was saying was correct. Very, very, very correct. Right. But the way we are presenting it and explaining it, right? I mean, the way my colleague was explaining it, right, was contradicting literature, right? Scholarly literature. So for me, and you are also presenting a same question here about objectives, right? Right. But you see, you know what an objective is, not so? You know what objectives are, and you know what research questions are. And that's why you actually need to read books, right? And of course, if in case you don't understand, engage your doctoral, right? Your doctoral committee, right? and then ask them whether there are differences in there, significant differences, right? If they can't answer, then go back to the books and read, right? So now I can answer, but not in your confused way, as you said, so that you go back and now tell whoever told you that, the other man who is not part of our doctoral committee said this, right? So that now people begin saying, now, why do you attend those lectures? People are going to confuse you with this and the other, right? They will tell you that we are confusing you, right, when the confusion is actually coming from somewhere else. But let me say this, right? When we talk about research objectives are statements of what the study seeks to accomplish, right? And I think for many people who come from management, right, what objectives are, and you've been told that objectives must be smart. In other words, they must be specific, right? In other words, at the end of the day, they must also be measurable, right? Right. So you know all those aspects. I'll not go into details, but they describe, right, what the study seeks to accomplish. So research objectives are just statements. They describe the intended achievements of the research. So they answer the basic question: what does the researcher intends to achieve, right, in the study? And that's why the objectives are action-oriented. So that's why you say they are smart, specific, measurable, achievable, and realistic. So objectives are action-oriented. And that's why usually they begin with a verb such as to explore, to examine, to describe, to explain, all those words that you use. Examine, explain, right? Or compare. So the action words must be there. Of course, depending on the paradigms, right, and the philosophical orientation you are taking. And in fact, in this other next lecture that I'm going to take you through, I'll be emphasizing those paradigms, right, and also philosophical orientations. And I know some people will again come and say, but we are now confused. You have given us all this, where do we place it? I will show you where you're going to place it. Not in today's lecture, but in the lecture that I'm going to have this coming week, because I'll show you how the introduction chapter is supposed to be arranged, right, and the components that constitute it, and how the knowledge that we've been accumulating, right, through gap spotting, paradigms, and things like that, how that information should be presented in your introduction chapter, right? So that is very important. So for my friend, for example, who was looking at child agents among unaccompanied refugee minors, he might say, I want to explore, right, how these unaccompanied refugee minors participate in decisions affecting their lives within humanitarian settings, right? So that is an objective, and is using maybe explore, right? And of course, when you use the word explore, you know the type of study, where you are taking your study, right? Otherwise, another fellow will say, I want to examine. Now, research questions, ladies and gentlemen, are specific questions the study seeks to answer. Questions that the study seeks to answer, right? Now, of course, these research questions usually answer the question, what knowledge do we need to obtain, right? So in others, you have a research question. Now, for my friend, again, I forget his name, that is Quikiris, I think, if I'm not mistaken, Wilson. The issue that he had, right, he might come up with a research question like, how do unaccompanied refugee minors participate in decisions affecting their lives within humanitarian settings? You can see here the research question starts with how. And the moment he uses the word how, right, then he's telling you also what philosophical orientation, right? Or, I mean, the paradigm within which he's operating, right? And this is a research question. Remember, under the objective, right, we had the issue of to explore how unaccompanied refugee minors participate in decisions affecting their lives. Now, when you come here, say, how do unaccompanied refugee minors participate, right, in decisions affecting their lives within humanitarian settings? Then that is a research question, right? Now, of course, ladies and gentlemen, you can see that when you come from the philosophical point of view, right, the difference here might be subtle, but important, because the objectives represent the researcher's intentions, because they are goal-oriented, they are action-oriented, and achievement-oriented, right? And they focus on what the researcher intends to do, right? In other words, when you are stating them, you must be aware of that. But the research questions represent the knowledge that is sought. So they are inquiry-oriented, they are knowledge-oriented, and of course, investigation-oriented, right? So this is very, very important, right? What would be now the relationship between the objectives and research questions? The research questions are usually derived from objectives, right? So you need to know that, but if you have been taught differently, please, in your discussions, in your colleges, I should not become a subject of discussion, right? And what I can only say is that please go and read widely, and you'll be able to understand exactly what knowledge exists in that area. Now, the other question that I see that has been posed that I should actually answer, right, is from Sewanyana, right? And then from there, I'll continue with my presentation, right? So Sewanyana says, when undertaking a qualitative study, do I need to have both research questions and study objectives, right? Again, without being quoted in your college, right, that this gentleman said this or the other, and for me, I can only say go and read, right? My simple answer is yes, right? I've already articulated, right, what research objectives are and what research questions are, right? In most doctoral level qualitative studies, you should have both research objectives and research questions, because they perform different but complementary functions, right? And I can tell you why both are important, right? The research objectives state what the study seeks to accomplish. They represent the specific aims of the investigation, right? But the research question translates those objectives into questions that, of course, guide data collection, analysis, and interpretation. So I want you to think of the relationship in terms of really that you start with the research problem. And this is the order, incidentally, right? Think of the relationship, right? Like this, you start with the research problem, right? Then you go to the purpose of the study, you go to objectives, you go to research questions, and of course, after research questions, you go to methodology. So a well-aligned qualitative study should demonstrate this logical flow, right? So this is important, right? And you must do it very, very well, right? Again, if I take an example of Kwikiriza's study, right? Of course, he didn't tell me exactly the topic he's investigating and the issues of that nature. Those are these aspects. But for example, let's assume that Kwikiriza wants to reconceptualize child agency in humanitarian context. So, of course, if he's reconceptualizing and is looking at the participation of unaccompanied refugee minors in decisions affecting their lives, then someone, as I said earlier on, might want to explore how unaccompanied refugee minors participate in decisions. Now, the research questions, as I did specify, you can say, well, how do these unaccompanied refugee minors participate in decisions affecting their lives? You might even go ahead and have the second objective. You want to examine how unaccompanied refugee minors understand and experience agency within humanitarian contexts. And that can be the second objective. And then the research question will be, how do unaccompanied refugee minors understand and experience agency within humanitarian contexts? So what you need to notice here is that the objectives states the intention, while the question specifies the inquiry, right? Maybe now the other question that you want to ask, or that you have asked, that is part of what you have posted there, is that, are there situations where only research questions are used, right? And again, I might say, yes, they are, right? In some qualitative traditions, that's why you must read. You must read. In fact, if you don't read, you get confused, because you find one scholar who tell you, right, that you shouldn't have, right, objectives and research questions, right? Then the other fellow, and these might be individuals on your doctoral committee. One says you should never have objectives and research questions. Then the other fellow on doctoral committee, the second one, will tell you you should never have objectives, only have research questions, right? So that's why you need to read widely, and no one will probably teach you these things, ladies and gentlemen. So you must struggle, and that's why a PhD is a lonely journey. And that's why Makerere University decided to introduce the aspect of the doctoral committee, because they discovered that within the doctoral committee, a long time ago, they discovered that supervisors, in fact, used to have no supervisors, 2 supervisors, right? But students used to take 10 years, 20 years, right, on a doctorate, right? You have only 3 or 2 supervisors, one disagrees with the other. In other words, the student now becomes the battleground for their disagreements and misunderstandings, and also for failure to understand the knowledge domain very well. So they transfer that, and you suffer. And I know very many people who did not get their PhDs from Makerere University a long time ago because of those problems. So now the reason why you have a doctoral committee, and especially the time when they had to bring in 5 people, the idea was that if you have 2 supervisors, right, or let's say 3 supervisors who disagree, then the other 2 members of the doctoral committee are able to resolve those issues, right? So that they can actually overrule the other 2 or the 3 main supervisors, and that at the end of the day, you will have sanity, right, within the student's work as he traverses the doctoral journey, right? So anyway, let me answer this question without going into those issues. Of course, now you can have 4 members of the doctoral committee, but of course, Makerere is very clear. They will always give you either 1 supervisor or 2 supervisors, and the other ones are just members of the doctoral committee. And they also play a major role, right? And never ignore them. So, are there situations where only research questions are used, right? That's a question that our friend Sewanyana probably wants to know, right? And the answer is very simple, as I have already said. Yes, in some qualitative traditions, and let me give you those traditions, right? These are grounded theory, right? 2, phenomenology. 3, ethnography. 4, narrative inquiry. And to some extent, right, what I call certain interpretivist and constructivist studies, right? And in these studies, researchers sometimes rely primarily on research questions and may not explicitly state detailed objectives. Right, but let me say, right, despite these, and you find these in journal articles, by the way, publications being made in this area, right, and even there are arguments and counter arguments, right. You find that this can be an area that is largely contested, right, but right in most universities, and please mark words, in most universities, doctoral committees, right? In some universities, colleges, faculties, depending on the nomenclature that you are using at your university, right? In most of those universities, and also ethics committees now, the ethical review boards, and also examination boards, still expect, right, these two, both objectives and research questions, because they improve clarity, they improve alignment, and of course, they bring this element of evaluation, right, a little bit clearer, so that at the end of the day, you know, the examiners are given some kind of yardstick to use when they're evaluating your work. So you'll find that objectives are part of the issues that the examiners must look out for. So for the thesis that you are going to write, I strongly recommend that you must have some of those things, like the objectives. You can have actually general objectives, specific objectives, and research questions, unless your college insists and tells you that please leave out these things. But if they don't really tell you to leave them out, please do not leave them out. Right, let me see. I think, what is the other? Oh, someone is asking me whether I am sharing a screen. No, I am not sharing. Someone asked a question and I am responding to the questions that they asked, right? And if you, maybe you have just joined, but if you look at the chat room, right, you'll find you'll find the questions there, right? Maybe I should answer one more question. There are so many questions here. Thank you. This is Ivan. How do I yes. How do I advance a managerial issue or managerial issues such poor road construction as result of stealing money or public concerns like road accidents into a scholarly research problem? All right, and Muchuru Moses Okecho, Professor, when you asked that, what is your research philosophy? When you are asked that, what is your research philosophy? What would I answer? In other words, what is a research philosophy? Right. Let me see. Are there more questions? Muchuru Okecho. Okay. The other one is asking whether I am sharing the screen. Right. Let me start with Ivan. Right. Thank you, Ivan. Right, for asking this question. And your managerial issue is poor road construction due to theft of public funds. This is a practical problem, or what I call a managerial concern. Right. Now, as I've been saying, a doctoral researcher must move beyond this condition or the condition itself and ask questions like what explanations already exist, right, for that element of stealing money that you are talking about, or theft, or for corruption in public infrastructure projects. Right, you can actually take it to that level of public infrastructure projects instead of looking at only road construction, right? Because road construction, right, is just one element. And if you're going to look at road construction alone, I don't know how many projects you are going to study, right, in your country, unless the study is a constructivist or interpretivist. Right? Otherwise, if it is a positivistic or logical positivism, we expect you to have a very huge sample. So unless you have over 100 rods, right, for you to collect data and conduct statistical estimations that my friend Joseph was articulating this morning, for some of you who attended our lectures, right? Otherwise, if you start now aggregating your data at a very wrong level of analysis or unit of analysis, you have problems. I think I should have a lecture in future talking about unit of inquiry and unit of analysis so that we understand. And I'll have numerous topics to illustrate that element because I've found people having issues here and there, and some of them actually reach up to the level of examination, right? And if someone collapses your work at the level of unit of analysis and he says, well, you don't have sufficient sample because for you picked data from 300 individuals and you're analyzing at the individual level, yet you should have analyzed at the organizational level. And he discovers that you only started one organization. The fellow will say, well, why don't you use a case study methodology, right? So he's giving you another orientation, a philosophical perspective, right, and another element of the paradigm, right, where you are going. So for my friend Ivan, right, look at explanations, those explanations that already exist for corruption in public infrastructure projects. Ask yourself, why do those explanations appear inadequate? And what remains to be known is another question that you should ask yourself. And what contradiction or anomaly or deficiency or unresolved issue exists in current knowledge? Those are the things that we have been discussing. I think you've not been attending our lectures. Right. So again, I'll not go into details of your work, but if you want to turn that into a scholarly problem, right, you can, for example, again, I'm just thinking aloud, right? I may not give you the ideal issue, but you might say, although accountability and monitoring mechanisms are expected to reduce opportunistic behavior in public infrastructure projects, corruption and poor road construction outcomes continue to occur despite the existence of such controls. And then you go ahead and indicate that existing theories provide limited explanation of how informal institutional norms, political patronage networks, and maybe organizational cultures interact to undermine accountability in road construction projects. So of course here, if you take it to this dimension, that means you would have started from where you started from, right? And you know where you started from. You said, well, right, I am dealing with a managerial issue, like poor road construction is a result of stealing money or public concern, like road accidents so how do I put this into a scholarly research? So that's how you can look at it. Again, once you present that idea can actually generate so many problems, right? And many statements, and you can have many studies from that, as long as you can get more evidence, right, to prove your point. Right, let's go to Muchuru. Muchuru asked a question. Professor, when you are asked that, what is your research philosophy? What would I answer? Again, we spent some good time on this. Maybe you are attending for the first time, right? What is your research philosophy? They are essentially asking, what assumptions do you hold about reality? What assumptions do you hold about knowledge? And how should knowledge be generated, right? So in other words, in this case, your research philosophy refers to the set of beliefs that will actually guide how we understand reality and how we acquire knowledge, as simple as that. At its core, as we saw earlier on, research philosophy answers 4 major questions, right? And the first question is, what is reality, right? And that's where we have that cosmetic word that we call ontology, right? Does reality exist independently of us? Or is reality socially constructed, right? So in other words, the ontological perspectives must be brought out. The other aspect is how can we know reality, right? And that is epistemology, right? So how are we going to know that reality? And I'll not go into details of epistemology, right? The third element that they will be asking is what role do values play in research? And that is axiology. I mean, can researchers, for example, be value free? Or do values inevitably influence inquiry? And I think we've seen the axiological dimensions under interpretivist and constructivist, and also under logical positivism, right? And then, of course, you move down to the last bit because you move from ontology, epistemology, axiology, then you move into methodology. And in methodology, you're asking yourself, how should research be conducted, right? Should we use experiments? Should we use surveys? Should we use interviews, right? That kind of thing, right? And I think that is very, very important. And the various paradigms that we saw, you bring in these aspects, right? If you are under positivism, interpretivism, then you should be able to bring out these perspectives very, very well. So, and again, this is very, very, very important. And I think many of us need to think about those perspectives. Right. So having said that, ladies and gentlemen, allow me to do one thing. I don't know whether we shouldn't rest for about 1 or 2 or 3 minutes so that we sip a glass of water or, right. But I think, can we rest for about 3 minutes? 3 minutes. And then after the 3 minutes, we can embark on the statement of the problem. Is that okay, ladies and gentlemen? 3 minutes, only 3
Okay,
minutes.
Professor.
Okay.
Yes,
Thank
it is
you,
okay,
bro.
Doctor. Professor.
It's in order.
Okay, let's say rest for about 3 minutes, and then we go to the statement of the problem. Thank you.
Vehicle, we got it at how much?
50. Later on.
Oh, I'm just thinking to sell it to sell it at how much?
Then, time for. If you start looking for someone who can get it.
I'm thinking you can increase the pricing. For example, if we had to work on the outside, kakala mwakachitako shani. Shani.
Kweko ingawomba win.
All right, I think welcome back. We need to get going so that within the next 15 minutes, we are done. And I'm going to use an example to illustrate some of the things that I want to talk about, right? So what we are going to do is to look at the statement of the problem. And I think within 5 minutes, I will share, right, the slides here. Let me see if I can see the slides. But before I share the slides here, okay, I think this is it. Okay. The slides now. Okay. All right. And I think I might even borrow a few minutes from your time, right? so that we probably extend by around 15 minutes. And again, I will be using an example that comes from our friend Kwikiriza. Kwikiriza, are you with us?
Yes, I am, Prof. I'm here.
Right. So since you understand your area very well, right. But anyway, it's always very important for us to think about a statement of the problem and know exactly those particular components that constitute the statement of the problem. Right. We are now actually transiting to a statement of the problem. And if you don't have one, then you have issues. Now, what I'm going to do is to summarize, right? And of course, you can see, I'll take you through components that constitute, right, the statement of the problem. As I said earlier on, this is one of the most, right, scrutinized. People will always read the statement of the problem, right? And that usually happens, actually it's placed at the end of the introduction chapter. Right? In chapter 1, you have all those things that you write about, right? Depending on the university where you are coming from and how they are sequenced, right? But finally, you land, right? It's like someone who has been flying up in the air, right? Let's imagine that you are coming from your country and going to USA. So you fly. The way you start from the ground, you go up there, right? And after getting to the height that you were really interested in, right, to maybe 39,000 feet below sea level, so above, not below. But you maintain, right, a certain level. Then at some stage, the pilot will begin telling you, you know, we have started our descent, right? And you will keep on coming down slowly and slowly. And sometimes at the time when you land, someone may not even know that you have landed, right? If you don't have so many other things that happen up there in the sky, if turbulence is not really much, right? You land smoothly, right? Because someone who cannot land all of a sudden from a height of 39,000 feet, right, above the ground, and you simply land to zero, right, you are going to crash. So even when you are writing, it's the same thing. You start up there, and then you start descending downwards, right, at the time when you actually hit the ground. So the statement of the problem lies in between there, right? You are moving up from there and coming down, and you must land with the statement of the problem. And people will read your statement of the problem. If it has a problem, then they will say, well, there is an issue here, right? Because they will begin asking a question, where did the fellow get the objectives from, right? Because your objectives, research questions, hypothesis, etc., must actually speak, right, to the statement of the problem. Now, if that does not happen, then you know you are in trouble, right? So, in other words, this is one of the most important areas, and that's why I'm actually spending a few more minutes, right, talking about the statement of the problem, right? I'm spending those minutes for you to know how important, right, the statement of the problem is, right, and probably know exactly what you are going to do in order to come up with a very good statement of the problem, right? So, of course, as you can see, a statement of the problem should bring in this element, right? What I call a scholarly argument. And as I said earlier on, I don't know whether you still remember, right? I know that my friend asked a question that was a Kwikiriza, and I told him, you see, you must move beyond, right? Just because, well, he presented the question at a time when we were looking at gap spotting. And I said, well, you might be having a gap statement, but you must move beyond the gap statement and explicitly demonstrate how your problem qualifies as a Popperian contradiction. That means you are coming from Karl Popper's perspective, right? Or how, right, it qualifies as a Kuhnian anomaly. And I'm talking about Thomas Kuhn, the structure of scientific revolution. For some of you have been attending, when I say Popperian, that's from Karl Popper, right? Conjectures and refutations, right? So you must move beyond just a simple gap statement, right? To explicitly demonstrate how the problem qualifies as a Popperian contradiction or a Kuhnian anomaly or a Lactosian, right, deficiency. And again, we covered Imran, lactose. For some of you who are just attending this lecture for the first time, I'll ask you to go to my YouTube, right? And there are those subsequent lectures, right from lecture 1, lecture 2, lecture 3, 4, 5, up 6 or 7, right? Even this one after this lecture, I'll post it there so that you can get the recording from there, right? So in other words, you must move beyond and get into that level, right? Imran Lactose, of course, is also one of those philosophers that have actually taught us a number of interesting things, right, on how we can actually generate problems, and after generating those problems, how we can actually craft philosophy into that particular problem. And then from there are a few other things that we do, right, so that you can easily have a statement of the problem. So some of the information that you do not present in the statement of the problem, they will be presented in the background to the study, right? For example, you have a section, right, that talks about the development of the constructs. You have the theories being presented in the theoretical background there. That's where you articulate most of the things. In the statement of the problem, you probably have one sentence, right? Or probably two sentences referring again to the theories that you would have presented in the background, right? If there are conceptual gaps, then you will be referring again to the conceptual issues here, right? And also bring in the practical elements that my friend here has just asked. I think that was Ivan, if I am not mistaken. So you must move beyond. So that's what I was telling my friend Kiriza, that you must go beyond that simple articulation. So I'll be showing you examples again based on Kwikiriza's comment that he made so that we understand. So at the end of the day, we want to have a very strong statement of the problem. So in terms of understanding, that is how we move. We move from phenomenon, right? We go to existing knowledge, and then we go to knowledge deficiency, then we articulate the significance and the contribution. So those must be part, right, of the statement of the problem, right? So I'm going to skip most of these things, right? But now talk about the components, right? These are components that must be part. And here I'm not worried about what you should write first. I know students usually ask as if there is a formula that you know. It's like when you are determining the area of a triangle, which is a half times base times height, right? And so forth. Or maybe you are talking about issues where you bring in those established formulas that you know, right? So, ladies and gentlemen, that's not how we really do it, right? In our case, it's important to understand those particular components that constitute the statement of the problem, right? So, of course, as you can see, the first component there is what is exactly happening, right? And that is very important because you must know, right, what is happening. Unless you know what is happening, it becomes very difficult right, for you to come up with a very good statement of the problem. In other words, who is affected, right? And where do we have those particular issues, right? So in other words, that is very important. The phenomenon must come out very well. You must describe it nicely, right? And that is a major element, right? So what is happening, that must be described. Otherwise, your statement of the problem is not really complete. So in other words, the practical problem, right, must come out. If you're talking about employee turnover, so you're actually telling us what is happening, and you say it is persistent, right? So who is affected in this case? Maybe the organization is affected, right? Because if you have a persistent turnover, then that means that the fellows who remained behind will not work very hard. They are actually affected also, right? Turnover has an effect. The fellows who remain behind do not contribute much. They will also be contemplating on how to live, right? So their productivity will probably reduce also. Who is affected and where does it occur? That is very important. Now, the second element that must be part of your work is existing knowledge, right? What is already known, right? And of course, this can be both empirical and theoretical, right? In other words, what are prior studies saying, right? And what does the theory say, right? Or the theories that have been used to explain, right, that particular phenomenon. And is there a gap, right, that exists? And that takes us to a third element that we call actually the knowledge deficiency. What remains unknown, right? What remains unresolved, or what is contradictory, right? Or inadequately explained. And this is very important. I've been talking about these issues. That's why now I'm not really spending too much time, right? Talking about these issues. Now, of course, the phenomenon was the first point here. As you can see, what is happening, who is affected, where does it occur? Maybe what I should have done is to place this in a sequence so that now the third element, right, comes in there, right, in terms of significance, right? Why does the deficiency matter, for example? That's why I told you that you have some problems, right? These could be managerial or otherwise, or policy problems existing, right? But they do not warrant, right, a study, right, of this nature, right? So that's why it is important for you, after knowing the phenomenon, right, the existing knowledge, of course, that's where you must have identified a gap, a research gap, right? And I've been articulating those particular gaps, and I'll not go into details of even these aspects that you see on the slide here, what remains unknown, right? All of those empirical, conceptual, theoretical, contradictory findings, all those are there. So the issue of significance, why does the deficiency matter, right, are very important, right? And of course, types of significance are there. Some are theoretical, others are practical, policy, social, methodological. I've already gone through these, right, if you recall. Now, component 5 is the contribution, right? So what contribution are you making to an existing body of knowledge, right? And you need to know these right from the beginning, right? So that at that level, you are talking about theory, maybe theory extension, right? So in other words, you are going to review, and that's where I think some students have been asking me, how many theories should I have in my work? And I think I've already answered that question, and I've been answering it. It depends on the statement of the problem, right? It depends on the practical problem that you want to explain, right? If one theory can adequately explain, right, why do you have to add a second theory and third theory? Right, it is not necessary. And I gave you an example last time when I told you that I have a student who is actually using only one theory, right? And he has already done his theoretical review, and he sent his paper for publication in Sage, and it has already been published, right? And he's going to use that framework that he has already published, and he's using one theory. He doesn't need a second theory, right? But if he wants to change and have two theories, then he can complicate his work further by introducing a second theory. That's okay. There's no problem. So your contribution can be in terms of theory extension, right? But could also be in terms of theory refinement, right? You want to refine a theory, or could be in terms of integration, right? And that's why if you find someone integrating two theories, it's okay. It's because one theory is inadequate in explaining his problem, and he feels that once he integrates two theories, he'll be able to explain. Now, of course, the biggest problem I have with most of our students is that they tend to stack theories, right? There's theory stacking. And when you look at the number of theories and how they are discussed in the introduction, right, they do not actually speak directly to the statement of the problem that is later stated, right? So at the end of the day, there comes a big issue reconciling the theories that are used, and that's why examiners will ask questions, right? And your doctoral committee will say, but don't you think that one theory would have sufficed, or probably two theories? Why did you have to use 5 theories, right? And I know that many students actually use 5 theories or 6 theories because they have not read those theories. You can imagine if you have read a theory, right, and that theory is documented in a book, right, of around, let's say, 800 pages, like the dynamic capability theory. Dynamic capability, I think, is about 500 pages. Then you have another one, which is stakeholder, maybe around 350 or 380 pages or 400. Then you have another one that has 2 volumes, volume 1 and volume 2. Volume 1 is about 800, volume 2 is about 1,200. Now you discover that most of the variables that you have in your work actually can be explained using one theoretical lens. Right, so or 2 theoretical lenses, why do you integrate 3 or 4 or 5, right? And sometimes some of these theories have different paradigm implications, right? Some are under constructivist, right, paradigm, right? Others are probably under interpretivist, while others are under logical positivism. And at the end of the day, when you look at the way he has articulated the issue right from the introduction to the statement of the problem, right, and the conceptualization, you find that it becomes very, very, very difficult, right, to reconcile that particular study. So, but the contribution must come out, right, within your statement of the problem. And of course, it can be in terms of those aspects that you see there, right? But it could also be in terms of developing a new theory, right? And that is your potential contribution, right? What new knowledge is expected from this work? And I should be able to see those aspects. And of course, the other could be in terms of conceptual clarification. The other day, when we were looking at construction and problematizing literature, and I think that was yesterday, we said, well, in some areas, you have debates, disputes, right? And all these are ongoing. So you may want to throw some kind of light on some of those particular debates, right? So all those are very important aspects, right? Right, so I think you can see how you build the statement of the problem, right, from context up to knowledge, deficiency, significance, and then you build the need, right, for research. But of course, there are other aspects that I have not mentioned that you should be aware of, right, like scholarly relevance, right? I don't have to emphasize it. How are you going to contribute to theory, concepts, or debates, or methodology? Researchability is another important aspect, right? Is your problem researchable? A statement of problem. Is it researchable? Sometimes we come up with those very huge, right, statements of the problem to the extent that it becomes very hard for us to research, right, on those particular issues. So I think allow me, ladies and gentlemen, to stop here, right, and then just go to examples, right. Maybe before that, I should let you know how you craft it. You begin with the context, so introduce the setting and the phenomenon, right? Then existing knowledge, you summarize accepted explanations. Then you bring out the deficiency, identifying a gap, right? And then, of course, explain why existing knowledge is insufficient, right? Significance, and then the need for research, right? Now, the other thing that you need to know, again, I'm just rushing through, is that you should not forget philosophical foundations, right? Because different paradigms generate different problems, right? And again, I'm going to demonstrate this using a case that is very close to what Wilson actually asked. So philosophical foundations are very important, and this should be embedded within your work, because a problem, again, will tell us the philosophical foundation, right? Then, of course, if you are under positivism, we'll be able to tell that, under logical positivism, right? Interpretivism, constructivism, all these aspects will